I would be ready to introduce session 1, stress test for responsible sourcing. And I think he will explain it in detail. So I'm not going into detail now, but I would like to say a couple of words about Patrick. Patrick Nadol is from the EIT Raw Materials. He's an expert in responsible sourcing of strategic minerals and metals. He holds a PhD in geology from the University of Auckland in New Zealand, and he has over 15 years of experience working at the interface between the mining industry, government, and academia. And in his current position as a senior advisor for exploration of resource assessments at the EIT Raw Materials, he focuses mainly on stakeholder engagement, raw materials, business intelligence, and innovative solutions for the exploration of and mining sector. Hello, welcome, Patrick Nadol. The floor is yours, and the next session is yours.
Thank you, Ursula. Thank you, Alex. And yeah, welcome everyone to our third online event. My pleasure to be hosting the first session of the day. It's a bit of an elephant in the room, the stress test for responsible sourcing, because the current geopolitical tensions that we're seeing are certainly a stress test, not just for responsible sourcing, but for other aspects as well. So this session will look at where are we in terms of our ambitions, what is being done, and where we can get practically, realistically in the next few decades. So welcome all. Thank you to the organizers. And I know this is often a divisive and provocative topic, controversial, sometimes even very emotional, but these are all trademarks of a wicked problem, but also trademarks of a problem that's obviously worth solving and worth dealing with and worth figuring out how to deal with it. We have already gone through the session housekeeping, so I will skip that part. Importantly, I just want to re-emphasize there is this Q&A button, or whatever the combination of letters may be in your language, that's at the bottom, and please participate actively through that. So, stress test for responsible sourcing. I just mentioned a few buzzwords. So what does that mean? Let me maybe paint a better picture for this session here and the panel discussion to follow. So these tension that we're seeing at the moment, they're certainly have economic pressures attached to them, and they somewhat highlighted the dichotomy between our ambitions, so the responsible sourcing ambitions, just mentioning things like the Green Deal, etc., and what is reality. So despite a recent ranking by EY that puts ESG once more as the #1 business risk for the mining and metal sector, where are we? Is sustainability, has that taken a back seat in the current climate? And can we afford to trade off priorities like that while we're facing a global climate crisis with all its economic and social ripple effects, obviously? So are we seeing, in a nutshell, are we seeing too little, too late, too slow in a situation when even too much might not be enough? Again, I'm putting this very, you know, into, I want to highlight this in this way to really, yeah, incentivize the panelists to react to those somewhat controversial statements maybe that I'm making here. So these ambitious sustainability goals that we set ourselves, are they still achievable, especially when supply chains are under these economic pressures that I mentioned? So these are the questions we would like to examine in this session and discuss how economic resilience, the twin transition, and responsible sourcing can be combined meaningfully, ethically, and sustainably, obviously. But before we dive into that, I'm sure, very lively panel discussion, we have a couple of input presentations that will present the roadmaps that have already been finalized through the resourcing project. So we will hear first from Marie-Therese Krügel, the Roadmap 2050 on renewable energy. Marie-Therese is a project researcher at the University of Leoben with a mining engineering background. And after that, we will hear another short presentation on the Roadmap 2050 on mobility by Johannes Beetz. He is a researcher at the Öko Institute with a background in battery chemistry, quite fittingly. Marie-Therese, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Patrick. So hello and welcome also from my side. Let me start off with a quote. Sustainability is the pathway to supply chain resilience. I chose this quote because I think it's very fitting for today's session. And studies do show that striving for sustainability not only contributes to the achievement of environmental, social, and economic goals in supply chains, but also to more resilient supply chains. So this is one of the many reasons why the Resourcing Project is working on establishing a joint vision for responsible sourcing. For this purpose, you've already heard that we have been developing roadmaps for 3 sectors that are key for the energy transition: the renewable energy sector, mobility, and electronics. All of our roadmaps are based on multi-actor consultations with representatives from policy, from industry and civil society, and from South Africa, from Chile, from the EU, and many other regions and countries worldwide. For this presentation, we are going to focus on the Resourcing Project's roadmap for responsible sourcing in the renewable energy sector. And the question we will be exploring in the next couple of minutes is how responsible sourcing in this sector can contribute to more resilient supply chains. First of all, in the roadmap, we think it is very important that responsible sourcing efforts consider the entire supply chain and the product lifecycle. So from the exploration of resources and reserves, their extraction, the product manufacturing, and finally their reuse and recycling. The renewable energy roadmap focuses on the mining of copper, rare earth elements, and quartz for the manufacturing of wind turbines and solar photovoltaic modules, and finally the recycling of those technologies. Our roadmap contains recommendations for policymakers, for industry, civil society, research, and academia. Based on our consultation process, we defined 5 overarching targets reflecting this supply chain and life cycle approach. So our targets are the creation of a level playing field, social sustainability and responsible production, responsible procurement, the achievement of the Paris Agreement and environmental sustainability, and finally, circular economy and decreased resource consumption. The dates you see here in this roadmap are not indicative of the urgency of the targets. Each target needs to be addressed now, but the targets are subdivided into milestones, and some milestones need to be achieved sooner. Some milestones simply take more time to achieve them. So for example, the decreased resource consumption requires far-reaching changes of our current economic system. Therefore, we have the time frame until 2050. We're now going to look at some of those targets in more detail. So considering circular economy and decreased resource consumption, we believe there are various measures that can be taken to not only improve the sustainability in supply chains, but also the resilience. So for example, reuse and recycling, increasing resource and energy efficiency, and so on. Specific aspects we are considering here are the creation of a market for secondary raw materials by introducing quotas for recycling and also for including secondary materials in new products. This is accompanied by research for the substitution of unrecyclable materials that we actually enable those recycling processes. It is also important to increase the awareness of the impacts our consumption patterns have on the environment, on climate, and on people. The public needs to be informed, and alternatives for our current consumption patterns need to be created. An improved cross-sectoral and cross-supply chain collaboration can increase resource efficiency, for example, by enabling companies to source the input material from waste streams of other companies. Considering the second target, the achievement of the Paris Agreement and environmental sustainability, the introduction of a life cycle business strategy, the electrification of production processes as far as possible, and innovation are only some of the possible measures to improve resilience. Manufacturers will be required to introduce take-back programs for their products and set up recycling infrastructure. This decreases the waste streams to landfills from end-of-life renewable energy technologies and infrastructure. And it also allows the manufacturers to reuse their own materials. Further guidance on this aspect is provided in our good practice guidance document that provides information on 4 real-life examples, as Alex has already mentioned before. And it allows peers to really learn from this example and apply similar projects themselves. Similarly, a life cycle assessment for new technologies and products is needed to evaluate materials also according to the social and environmental impacts before a product is brought to market. This is, of course, also useful for existing products to assess alternative sources. The goal is really to avoid negative impacts that can eventually lead to supply disruptions, for example. Finally, the most important target with regards to supply chain resilience is, of course, the responsible procurement. Here we really focus on the procurement process itself. So from the supplier selection, supplier assessment, supply chain due diligence, transparency, cooperation, etc. We subdivided the recommendations in our roadmap not only according to the targets and the milestones, but also according to the actor group. So in the case of responsible procurement, our recommendations for EU policymakers are improving the transparency in mineral raw material supply chains by cooperating with supplier countries, with companies, and introducing requirements for chain of custody standards. Additionally, we also recommend enabling responsible mining in Europe, naturally only using best practices available and supporting R&D to advance sustainability in mining operations. Industry is required to adapt their procurement strategies. On the one hand, by developing supplier assessments and contributing to the creation of a shared database of shared resources to decrease administrative burdens for audits and assessments. This is actually another one of our good practice guidance cases. And on the other hand, by collaborating with suppliers to improve sustainability and to create trust in supply chains. Decreasing the complexity of the supply chains and the distance, for example, by local procurement, is another important measure to improve the supply resilience. Now, this roadmap has been developed more than 1 year ago, actually. And we are now looking at very different geopolitical circumstances. So after hearing these recommendations and what we deem necessary to achieve responsible sourcing, as well as more resilient supply chains, I want to invite you to think about the question, can we actually still achieve our targets? Or do we simply have other more pressing issues we need to worry about at the moment? With that, I hand back over to you, Patrick. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marie-Therese. And I would like to, before we move on to Johannes, please ask your questions on the platform using the Q&A button. Depending on your language setting, that might be a different combination of letters, but please let us know your questions after this first section here with Marie-Therese and Johannes' presentations. There will be time for maybe 1 or 2 questions that I will pick online. So please, we want to hear from you as well. So, and with that, thank you again, Marie-Therese. We move on to the second roadmap on mobility presented by Johannes Beetz. Johannes.
So thanks a lot for the opportunity to speak today and to present our work from the mobility sector. We also have a similar picture as you've seen before for the renewable energies. We also looked at different sectors and for a roadmap until 2050. And there we have the topics of responsible procurement, circular economy, and decreased resource consumption, and the level playing field. So we focus only on 3 main topics. However, of course, there are overarching topics like the Paris Agreement, planetary boundaries, and strong sustainability, which are like the overarching goals for this. For these 3 topics or targets, you could call them, we also formulated several milestones and recommendations specifically for policymakers, industry, and civil society. As I do not have time to go into depth into all of them, I will just give you a brief overview over certain milestones in these 3 topics and try to correlate them to the general question if we can still achieve them due to the global economic and other tensions and crises we have at the moment. In my view, to take my conclusions a little bit to now, circular economy and decreased resource consumption, in my view, is actually easier to achieve if in view of the global crisis at the moment, as it's a lot also about decreasing consumption, sufficiency, and so on, and also about less producing less, reusing more. On the other hand, responsible procurement and level playing field, at least from my view, seems to be more difficult. Why that is like this, I will come to now. So first target, circular economy and decreased resource consumption. First, the definition for circular economy, as I think a lot of you have heard about it, but everybody understands something else. From my point of view, it's mostly about eliminating waste and pollution, but also creating products that they can be recycled. So looking at the whole value chain and trying to get the whole economic system to bend to the ideal of reusing the material to produce new products, using less materials, keeping products into use, and regenerate natural systems. For us, this means recycling, resource efficiency, energy efficiency, but also changes of economic system, reduce resource consumption in general, change mobility patterns, as we are talking about the mobility sector in this case, and reuse. So looking at the milestones, I know this is a lot of text, but just to highlight some of these aspects, we have milestones for 2025, 2030, 2040, and 2050. and we have to start now to be actually able to achieve our goals in the long term. One big impact will make the resource efficiency, also including design for recycling and waste policies, which have to be implemented now to be able to reduce our resource consumption. We need to stop the growth of cars registered in the EU, and then so this is done by 2025, hopefully, and then we need to try to decrease the numbers over the next years down to 10% by 10% compared to now by 2030, and down to 30% by 2040, and for 2050 to actually achieve a reduction of primary resource consumption by 80% compared to 2035, where we expect the peak of resource consumption for traction batteries for electric mobility. To actually achieve this goal, we think that it's actually necessary to decrease the number of registered cars by at least 50%. So this will be easier if you think about the growing tensions. However, we also need to have a shift to electric mobility in general at the moment. So this means we need to change the in general the numbers of ICEs, internal combustion engines, have to go down drastically, and we need incentives for changing behavior. So using more public transportation, using more car sharing, or reducing mobility in general by measures like home office and so on. There are a lot of other milestones to be achieved, but yeah, as I said, I do not have time to go down in every little detail. So next topic would be responsible procurement. There we are looking at transparency, standards for tracing and recycling. We have enough standards for mining that we don't need new standards there, but we need standards which are also able to report of tracing raw materials, and also for smelting and recycling. We need a global supply chain due diligence, and which is also very important to define what actually a sustainable product is. So what is a sustainable battery? We need a global understanding of this as well. More local development, Marie-Therese already talked about this. Then this is also connected to supplier assessments, intra-supply chain cooperation to make it possible that people talk to each other and enable a responsible procurement in the first place, and mining in the EU, as we cannot just shift the burden of mining to other countries. So if we look at the milestones for each of the years, starts at 2025 with things like to widen the view of responsible sourcing to all three pillars of sustainability, so ESG. As I said, new standards for tracing of raw materials and for smelting and recycling, and also to find a common understanding of a sustainable product, a sustainable battery. It also can include things like promoting the local development through local procurement. We need elimination of worker rights abuses and supply chains. And this is also supported if trade agreements include from now on supply chain due diligence, at least for the G7 for all materials. For 2030, we are even more ambitious, going in the direction of the SDGs and also supply chain due diligence laws for the European level, zero financial crime, the social license to operate for new recycling, cell production, and new mines. And also within the EU that 100% of minerals and semi-products are purchased actually from responsible sources or responsible recycling processes. Not all recycling is by nature sustainable or responsible, so it needs to have also standards for that. Of course, this is also connected to renewable energy. along the entire supply chain by 2040. And by 2050, we would like to have no more negative impacts from the whole supply chain. So looking one step back, as I said, this is probably more difficult to achieve looking at the global crisis at the moment. However, it's also connected to a higher resilience of the supply chain, as Marie-Therese said before. Next target would be the level playing field, so that actually stakeholders, actors in the field who are more ambitious concerning ESG standards and so on do not have a disadvantage by that. And this means that not only the cheapest product should win, but the polluters have to pay. There has to be a principle of quality over price, harmonization of standards, and also harmonization of general standards for mining and production, not only in the EU, but around the world. And this also includes formalization of ASM, mandatory minimum standards to have a baseline, and producer responsibility, where we need to rely also on international cooperation. For the milestones, as I said, the polluter pays principle and border tax adjustments should be achieved by 2030. The extended producer responsibility as well as harmonized sustainability and reporting criteria, why we need to establish a harmonized EU mining and production policies to actually make it possible to have sustainable mining in the EU. And there are several other topics. I won't go into detail, but one more important one from my understanding is that we need a free, prior and informed consent and a voice of civil society in the producing countries when it's about permitting processes for mining and production. And by 2050, we would like to have a common understanding and fulfillment of sustainable production methods and international level playing field for all actors. So in my view, as I said, this will be more difficult, but you can choose to agree or disagree with me. And this is the end of my talk. Thank you very much. I only had time to go into a very broad overview. So if you want to have more information about the mobility sector, our goals, and especially our recommendations, please go to our website where you can look into the published document. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Johannes. Yeah, very good. We do have actually one question, and I want to re-emphasize what you just said. Please, for further information, please go to the resourcing website or reach out directly to Alex from the WU Vienna. Before we move into the panel discussion, there was one question I saw for Johannes, and that was, what do you mean by repurposing? You did mention, obviously, recycling as one important aspect, and you did mention repurposing. Maybe you can a little bit elaborate on that, Johannes, if I can bring you back in.
Yes, please. So the question is very good. So our focus, perhaps I wasn't clear on that, is not only the mobility sector, but especially lithium-ion batteries for electric mobility. And there we have repurposing by reusing the batteries at the end of life for a vehicle, repurposing them in another application, like, for example, as energy storage application at stationary storage. So if you want to power your house with electricity and a solar panel, that you can actually use a battery from an electric car instead of a new battery, and just further intensify the use of the production and make sure that the energy and resources which went into the battery, are used even further.
Yes, thank you for your reply. And I believe that's essentially and intrinsically part of the design for circularity as well. This kind of approach, I would argue. So thank you very much. I don't see any further questions to our first two speakers. So thank you, Marie-Therese. Thank you, Johannes. To all of you, you can still obviously ask your questions throughout the session and throughout the day. Please put them in the Q&A section of Zoom online on your browser or in your application. But now it's time to deep dive into this topic with a panel discussion. And before I kind of rehash the points I made at the very beginning, let me introduce the panel to you. And I'm really excited to have such a great group of people here from different stakeholder groups. We have Cecilia Mate from Transport and Environment, an NGO. Cecilia is the Clean Vehicles Officer at TNE with a business background and public affairs experience in the transport and energy sector at EU level. We have, I hope, Jan Notre Dame from CSR Europe, a consultancy. Jan has a law background and is the co-founder of CSR Europe, a network of 100 corporate members and national partner organizations that supports and unites over 10,000 enterprises across Europe on corporate sustainability and responsibility. We have Ashlyn Ramlochan from Anglo American. Ashlyn leads the sustainable supply chain function at Anglo American, one of the world's largest diversified mining companies, as we are all aware, I'm sure. He's part of their effort and ambition to create and further inclusive supply chains. And last, but very certainly not least, Richard Glorgin from the Helmholtz-Zentrum Dresden-Rossendorf, an RTO. Richard has a PhD in marine geoscience and is the lead scientist at HZDR HIF. He has led relevant Horizon projects before and is now leading the EU project that also focuses on ESG aspects in the extractive sector called Vector that has recently started. So a warm welcome to all my panelists. And before I give the word to you, I just want to quickly rehash where we are here. So how big is the gap between our responsible sourcing ambitions and reality in the current global setting? Do we need to change our mindsets more drastically than we maybe already have, or adjust our business models from short-term benefits to more purpose-driven? Are the two mutually exclusive? And how is all of this achievable in the current geopolitical climate? And the pun is very much intended here. So with that, I would like to give the word to Cecilia first, and then I would like to make the round, maybe with 2 to 3 minutes reflections on those points that have been mentioned so far. Cecilia.
Sure, thank you so much, Patrick. Yeah, very good question, very difficult question to answer, but from Transport and Environment's point of view, what I can say is that it's, undeniable that the European Green Deal goals will require more critical raw materials. And these raw materials will probably have to come from new mining, but especially we will need recycling, right? So that's the key word around scaling up. Recycling, the role that some new mining will have, but the most important thing, and Johannes covered this in his presentation, is around ensuring that everything is done to the highest social and environmental standards. And a key component here, whether we go for new mining or for recycling, is scaling up refining, because the skills needed in refining are the same skills needed in recycling at the end of the day. So it's sort of a no regrets option in terms of EU strategy. And this is what really the focus should be for Europe. And that also ties into, existing mines. What can we do with them? Is there waste, for example, that we can remine? So again, the investments in refining and recycling are really a no regret option.
Very good, thank you, Cecilia. and we can dive into some of those aspects more deeply in a second. But I would like to pass on the same question, so the reflection on what has been said so far, to Jan, if he's
Yes.
actually
Hello?
in the meeting.
Yes, you hear
There
me?
you are. Great to see you.
Yes.
Yes.
Hi. So, well, thank you very much, Patrick. And yes, your question about what is the gap between ambition and reality. Looking and focusing maybe a little bit on what is currently happening in Europe on due diligence. What we see is the following. 99% of the energy from many different actors have been spent on the elaboration of a European regulation on due diligence, and which I think everybody is welcoming, so that we have a more harmonized, coherent playing field. However, this is giving much stress on the duty of care, which is exactly what we need. And I would say that COVID and the crisis today is putting even more light on this need. But the impact might be extremely poor if it doesn't go together with spending far more energy on what we call the duty to collaborate. And that is where we are missing Europe nowadays, not mobilizing the reflection on what should be the capacity building, the accompanying measures, even for the very large firms, that when you see them locally acting, the level of loneliness is amazing. So that is what we see today. Europe might end with a kind of exacerbation of tensions, because our partners are looking at Europe, flagging nice principles and values and now regulations. But what is the real impact of the Europeans on enhancing the livelihoods of farmers, miners, and workers? So where do we walk the talk of our beautiful values and principles and regulations? That's the big question. There is hope. There has been some work done, but it is very much unknown. It's under the carpet, but maybe I can take that for another question.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Jan. You actually you had some beautiful keywords there. Level of loneliness. That is, we have to come back to that one for sure. It's interesting that you say collaboration is an issue in the EU. That's something I wouldn't have necessarily expected. So maybe we can go back to that point later. But yeah, let's pass it on to Ashlyn. Can you please, in the same way, maybe reflect on the initial statements, and maybe also to the other speakers what they have said so far, Ashlyn?
No, thank you, Patrick, and good afternoon, good morning to all of you. I'm working semi-remotely between the airport and home, so if there's a drop in quality in my signal, please let me know, and I'm happy to reiterate the key points. Thanks again to the speakers. I think it was really fascinating to listen to that perspective, and I think what I'd like to bring to the table is some of the realities we pick up with some of the legislation, how that may actually impact different parts of the world. I feel quite privileged to live in South Africa, which has its slew of problems. I'm looking forward to having a glass of wine with some of you at the Mining Indaba at the back end of next February, where we can actually share a bit more. Just reflecting on some of the elements, when I look at the key challenges for responsible procurement, and Jan, building on the points that you've highlighted, I think we can't underestimate how challenging it is for suppliers to be able to engage with formalized supply chains. And I think the higher levels of complexity that are created, which are critically important, makes it that much more challenging to work actively with suppliers if there's no commitment to their development and increasing capacity within the industry. So I do think there's quite a nuance coming up, listening to the themes that we've spoken about. Some of the things that have really stood out is if I think about the reality of, so firstly, let me take a step back. I think I welcome the world that we live in at the moment, because I think over the last 3 to 4 years, we've been looking at sustainability more differently than we have for a long time before this. I think COVID was something which challenged what our value chains look like. I think it stimulated significant conversations about where we have threats in that value chain, and has forced companies to think 2, 3, 4, 5 tiers into their supply chains. And I think at the same time, what was really interesting is you've had legislation in the world. So the Modern Slavery Act in the UK, the equivalent act in Australia, the EU due diligence, which are forcing supply chains to have greater levels of transparency, and therefore pushing a bigger duty on formalized supply chains like ours to understand where risk may sit and not look away where there's an opportunity to intervene. So I think we're in a very interesting space when it comes to sustainability. And I think we're reaching that really crucial point now where, with protracted economies all over the world, whether we can actually put the appropriate investments and put the critical controls in play to ensure that we're able to satisfy stakeholders, but also do that responsibly. So I think it's a very, very interesting space that we're in. Some of the issues, and I don't want to elaborate too much because I know I'm mindful of time. Some of the issues I see that are probably not addressed, and probably a few blind spots we need to think about is, again, as you think about a more increasing data footprint, how do you get clear visibility of that footprint? How do you get suppliers to be able to share with you parts of their value chains and potentially undermine their competitive positions or the value that they may have with those suppliers? Who bears the cost of compliance? And at what point is there an expectation to work more collaboratively within industries to get to that point? I think Marie mentioned a very interesting point about this massive duplication and lack of sharing within industries. That's something certainly we see within mining. I think certain sectors like electronics, you have effectively a bunch of companies that have committed to different protocols, and that makes suppliers to common companies, it makes it a lot easier to work with. But I think being able to provide adequacy both within industries becomes super critical, because otherwise you have this lack of mutual recognition and therefore sharing of data. I think there's potentially something we need to have a real discussion about when we think about how do we create inclusive supply chains, on what is our commitment to capacity development, and at what point does the risk of introducing new suppliers become too much of an issue in terms of risk appetite for businesses, because you do have questions of reliability that come through from there. So yeah, a few thoughts, a bit scattered, but I love the fact that there are roadmaps in play. I love the fact that there's a stronger drive for harmonization, because I think that's incredibly critical. But I do think the points around industry collaboration, potentially looking at how do we get smarter and better at effectively making suppliers that want to work with us, making the expectations clearer without incurring significant compliance costs on their side. I think that's the really fragile space we need to balance off as we think about the new space.
Yeah, very, very good, Aislinn. And you dropped some really good keywords that we need to discuss. One point I want to make is that we will have a dedicated session actually that looks more into technical aspects of supply chain due diligence, particularly. So blockchain technology, for example, and those aspects will be discussed in a dedicated session tomorrow, if I'm not wrong, Alex or Ursula, correct me if I'm wrong. So these are very good points. So I think almost everybody mentioned harmonization, and I want to use this word to come back to maybe the key focus of the session before I let Richard, let you answer that first reflection, is because harmonization in a way that kind of jars with what we're seeing geopolitically in the world at the moment. Harmony is not necessarily a word I would choose to describe what's going on in the world at the moment. So maybe with that backdrop, Richard, can you maybe also reflect on that discrepancy or not between the ambitions for responsible sourcing and what we're seeing in reality?
Yes, thank you for the question. It's a very, very complex question. I'm not sure I will be able to answer that question right now, but maybe I can give you a few keywords. I was very happy to hear about the word collaboration, because I think it's totally true. We have zero collaboration in many aspects, and that is at multiple scales. And I think it's driven by the paradox that right now there is a very, very strong demand for mining, but actually there is no willingness to have mining. And that is something that is a problem. So it is not a problem that will be solved if we don't change a few things. So other keyword that I heard, it's the value chain. And I think it's very, very, let's say, maybe not really a chain. So I think it's totally disconnected. And that is one of the reasons why we have so many problems. So this collaboration is also the collaboration within the sector. And why it is disconnected, it's because everything is market driven. So we have the mining company sell a product to a processing company that will probably sell it to different companies who will make products, and everything is disconnected. Everything is just driven by the market. And it's very difficult to make it sustainable because there is not this value chain that you can control from A to Z. Everything is disconnected with different partners and actors. And as long as we will not make sure that there is this collaboration along the value chain and that we have really a value chain, it will be extremely difficult to reach sustainability. And I think it's something that I personally find it extremely important, is that the only way we can reconnect this chain is the purpose. Why do we need mining? Why do we need sourcing? And who will do that and how? It's very, very easy to blame. Yeah. So the customer is quite easy to blame the mining, but will not blame itself. So one very nice example I heard recently is that everyone is happy to have electrical cars now, but the problem is that no one decided to decrease the power of the electrical cars. The electrical cars actually are getting bigger, more expensive, demanding more material than the cars before. So it means that at the end, the customer will drive an increase in things that ultimately he doesn't want. And I think it's very important that we go back into a value chain driven by purpose and not by market.
Very good. Thank you, Richard. All of you gave me a whole bunch of brilliant keywords. So I will now mix up the order of people, and I can see you all. So if you want to jump in, please raise your hand, and I can try to give you the word. It's always a bit more difficult online, as you all know, to have these panel discussions. But I want to go back to Jan first, because one key thing that was mentioned now by several of you is a lack of collaboration, a disconnection of value chains even, and players not being committed, not talking to each other. So you also mentioned this beautiful term, the level of loneliness, Jan. Maybe can you elaborate on that? Because obviously we hear in a meeting that's from a Horizon Europe project, so clearly a collaboration is happening. But maybe you can elaborate more what you mean by this loneliness and this maybe lack of collaboration that you see.
Well, I have to pay tribute to Stefan Kretz, the executive director of CISA Europe. He's currently in DRC, and the work we are doing there with the support of GIZ is to see where we can increase the level of understanding and trust among local players in two provinces where there are mines, and to see, okay, what are methodologies that can bring and unite together players that for such a long time are there with a lot of distance, in fact. And especially when it comes to the challenge for forging local capacity building among players to diversify economic activities and jobs in regions where mines are a kind of monopoly, with everything that goes around in terms of human rights problems, environmental problems, without even talking about the armed forces that are playing a very strange role there. But the question that we put to ourselves together with the OEMs, with the automotives, which we work a lot with, CISA Europe is facilitating or coordinating what is called Drive Sustainability, which is a collective effort of the automotives to embed human rights and environment into their supply chains. But when you go locally, it's extremely difficult to have companies to go beyond pilots, artisanal projects, if I can say so. I don't speak about the artisanal miners, but this each on its own doing a nice little project that doesn't reach any impact. So the loneliness is not only with the large mining, but also with the other key actors. And it's a strong demand. We had a discussion just a year ago with Mrs. Basaiba. She's the Vice Prime Minister in Congo, in charge also of sustainability. She is asking, I want to collaborate with European and maybe international OEMs and see what is it that we can do locally. And it's bloody difficult. And that is why we are using that word of loneliness. But we see that it is of the responsibility of the large buyers, especially here in the case of automotives. It's part of the responsibility, the level of power and performance and benefits they do should integrate a much bigger responsibility to invest in forging these local ecosystem partnerships, and not only through pilots. That doesn't result in anything. So where do you build also a value chain with a much wider offer of education that can conduct to other jobs than only being there in a mine? Is it an official mine or an artisanal mine or whatever? Look, I will not go further on that. We will send you a link to this article by Stefan on the loneliness of mining companies.
Right. Thanks, Jan. That's a very good point, and I want to bounce that back to Ashlyn now. Jan, maybe is it also that you think, for example, big mining players need to be more meaningfully brought into any collaboration that is happening or should be happening? And yeah, I want to pass this to Ashlyn now to respond.
Yeah, thank you, Jan, for the comments, and Patrick for paraphrasing it. I fully agree with those challenges, Jan. I think the one thing that we can't get away from is the discomfort around materials not being beneficiated closer to source. So typically, when you think about the southern part of the world where most materials are manufactured, they typically would be sent off in raw form to other parts of the world, remanufactured and sold back at significant premiums. And there's always a discussion about how could you effectively localize manufacture or levels of manufacture and then feed those into larger OEM networks. And that's something which, certainly from our company perspective, we're influencing really strongly. So we're using a lot of our procurement muscle. So we spend about $14 billion a year in procurement, primarily of mining goods. If I look at the distribution that we have, we would spend about probably 70% of that with under 500 companies, very large companies. And we're using much of that muscle with those companies to drive local relevance around their programs. I agree completely that when OEMs or mining companies think about markets where they work, there tends to be a paternalistic view in terms of what good development programs look like. And what we've seen is significant investments in projects that are not sustainable beyond pilot, significant programs which are done without consultations with the host communities around where relevance sits. And I think, unfortunately for mining, there's an expectation both from our customers and from our community stakeholders that mining resources are infinite. And I think that's a very difficult one, because we're obsessed about the problem of how do we move away from the narrative of mining to material stewardship, because that is ultimately what makes what we're doing a lot more sustainable. And it's building those networks into our customer base, which is super critical. But conversely, from a supply chain side, where we look at responsible procurement to drive discussions on the circular economy and look at how do we create those value streams in conjunction with influencing our OEMs to partner more meaningfully on the ground, especially when it comes to both social investment projects. So I'm going to take a step back, because I think we shouldn't refer to these as social investment projects, because that's, I think, part of the issue, right? Where people feel compelled to invest in a school or in a little boutique project. Not that those are bad things, but they need to be done in a more coordinated manner, where we're able to leverage what's going to drive meaningful development in larger territories. And I think that's a trick that we're starting to get right. If I look at, again, the work in Anglo American, we do something called collaborative regional development. And as part of that, we've pulled together stakeholders from the mining sector. So working with 5 to 10 different mining companies, along with research institutions and similar, and look at the areas where we have the biggest impact and how we could transfer into those areas the right levels of development, where we work in partnership with government, OEMs, and funders around basic infrastructure that drives a more manufacturing-based economy. So yeah, sorry, and I can go on for quite a bit about this, and I hope I didn't miss the key points, Patrick, that you've asked for. But I do think, yeah, the point of collaboration. Very good,
excellent. Yeah, and it is a highly complex topic, and I have to almost apologize already to the other sessions that are going to follow, because we're touching already on some of those aspects that will be discussed later as well. So I want to pass it on to Cecilia now. All right, so I want to try to steer this back maybe, okay, all of these aspects that you all mentioned that are all highly relevant, how do they appear, how do they rate in the current geopolitical climate? Have they taken a back seat? Are we doing well and need to do even better? Should we not forget about those aspects that we mentioned? Are there any roadblocks now that weren't there before, let's say 12, 24 months ago? So with that in mind, I want to bring it back to you, Cecilia, now.
Yeah, thanks, Patrick. So I think, the current geopolitical situation has just stressed the urgency, right, to act upon raw material security for Europe in general. So the war with Russia, of course, has really accelerated things. If we think about the case of nickel, for instance, right, which Europe is largely dependent on for Russia. Yeah, without going into the fossil fuel debate, right? So I think, but we really think this is an opportunity for the mining industry and for Europe in general to really reset the scene, because for us it's clear that as Europe drafts this EU Critical Raw Materials Act, where we have a huge trade aspect coming in, we must partner with like-minded countries, right? So whether we want to partner with Australia or Canada, it's not the time to partner with basically Qatar or Saudi, right? Other regimes like Russia, if one can say. And then, so it was mentioned by Jan earlier, the due diligence, right? So for us, due diligence, the new due diligence law is the key tool to regulate the mining industry. And it's the key tool to really set a differentiator there for, between companies that can operate well or are doing better than others. But let's not forget that the mining industry overall has a legacy issue, right? I mean, Glencore was only fined last week. A few weeks ago, we had a coal mine disaster in Turkey. So these things keep happening. And that's why we need strong due diligence rules in order to set high environmental criteria, to make sure, that even exploration projects respect the rights of communities and of the environment. And due diligence is a progressive exercise, right? So again, I agree with what Jan said, that it's a matter of collaboration, but it's being a progressive exercise is not something you get right from the start. So collaboratively, we need to go out there, set these trade deals straight from the start, including in these trade deals high environmental and social criteria. And that's the only way that, we can move forward and get more greater consent, basically, from customers. So, that the automotive industry was mentioned as a big driver of this, and it's true. You have 6 automotive companies signed up to the Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance, which again is a multi-stakeholder governance. So it goes back to that piece around collaboration. Yeah, I think I can wrap it up there.
Yeah, we can come back.
Yeah.
We can maybe come back to some of the points of that. Yeah, please, all of you, raise your hand if you want to add to what's being discussed at the very second. So Richard, I see you raising your hand, and I actually, perfect segue there, Cecilia, that you gave. You talked about the Critical Raw Materials Act that's coming in Q1 next year, and you were talking about trade deals and this maybe leading, and I'm interpreting what you're saying, into diversification, essentially also in terms of the European raw materials market. To a degree, it's maybe clear that we cannot source it all, at least not in the short to medium term, right here, right now, responsibly. So where do we go with that in mind? And Richard, I know you have a good background in that. That's one thing I would like you to reflect on. And the other is, because it was also mentioned, the semantics of the discussion. Ashland mentioned it, something that we shouldn't call it that. We should actually call it so and so. That is, I find that's something that always pops up. And how important do you feel are semantics in all of this? And how do we maybe need to simplify our language, stay away from jargon, and can that help already as well? So Richard, a lot of things, I know.
Yeah, it's a lot of things, but I think I will make you happy, because I would disagree a little bit with Cecilia, because she said that due diligence is a key aspect. I think it's important, but I think it's not the only way to see it. The problem is a problem of responsibility. Who is responsible for the sustainability? And I think it's everyone. And it's not only for the mining companies to do the job. If we need the raw materials for our comfort or for our well-being, I think it's for everyone to be responsible for it. And we cannot put all the due diligence on the mining companies because they are driven by other aspects. At the end of the day, what they need to do is make money because they have shareholders, and their shareholders want the money. So of course they can do some due diligence and do some work to engage and to have participation. But the problem is that most of the time the money is not there where you need it. And I think Ashleen was very clear on that. The problem is that a mining company generates some, let's say, capital, but most of the capital will be done when you go to the refinement and when you generate the product. And this money is not going back to the mine or to the local communities where you have the mines. And that is the problem, is that we put a lot of pressure on the mines to do engagement and to do participation and to ensure that we have, let's say, the social acceptance. But at the end of the day, it's a business of everyone. And if you look at other sectors, like the renewable sectors, you have incentives they get a lot of money or they got a lot of money to do that right. But there is no incentive for the mining sector because it is deemed to be, let's say, a bad sheep in the industry. But actually, what we should do is make incentive and support the value chain right at the beginning to make sure that the local communities that will take most of the risk and the problems problems from the mining, and not the opposite, which is the case now. The local communities take all the risk, will get all the problems, benefit the least from the value of this chain. So I think it's very, very important that maybe we think back a little bit what is the case. And what Cecilia said, that it started because we have these big alliances and so on. I think it's okay, but it's not driven by the need, it's driven by, no, it's not driven by the purpose, but it's driven by the need to ensure the access to the raw materials. And I think when I go back to your question, Patrick, has it changed in a good way or a bad way? I'm not sure if it's a good way, because right now we are reacting. We are not acting to ensure that it will be done the right way. What we do is react, and the richest, the most powerful will get access to the raw materials. Doesn't mean that those who are, let's say, the least, let's say, the local communities will not really benefit from it. So right now we are ensuring that the Western countries and the big industry is accessing to these raw materials. That is clear. But is it what we want? I'm not too sure.
Yeah, thanks, Usha. And I see you, Jan, raising your hand. I just wanted to add one thing here. What you said resonated with me quite a bit. The reactive versus the active. Are we being too reactive? And is that something that can be said for the sector and specifically for Europe, bringing in the geopolitical angle when we consider China, for example, which obviously has a key role when it comes to sourcing and also processing raw materials. So do we need to completely change our approach here, or do we have the right tools in place and we just need to push a little bit harder? Maybe Jan, if your reflection on that.
Well, answering your last question, but also emphasizing on what Richard was saying, I stressed at the very beginning, but I would like to reiterate, the same day the Commission came out with its proposal for a regulation on due diligence, the Commission came out also, but it was extremely silent or in a very low mood. There was a guidance that was published, made by the Commission together with the International Trade Center, and it's guidance on designing effective and inclusive accompanying support to due diligence legislation. Very long, but most important, with almost 50 doers, actors in the field of sustainable supply chain, they were able to cluster very well the different roles. There's a shared responsibility, that is what we are talking about. It's not all on the head of only one key player, the miners, but to have this distribution of responsibility, they have been identifying very practically what are the practical actions for each of the key players. Is it government, companies, the role of industry, sectors, coalitions, or multi-stakeholder initiatives, the role of suppliers, of producers, workers and their representatives, but also of civil society and the investors. So it's an amazing bouquet, if I can say so, of actions that needs to be undertaken by all the actors. Otherwise, this top-down on a regulation falling on the head of only one player, yeah, the impact of that is not going to work. It's not going to bring any impact on the livelihoods of the people we are concerned about. So that is one element. On the due diligence regulation proposal, one more remark. Well, two remarks. One, there are many companies that will wait until the very end to take on board this regulation. They will not use it as an enabler to accelerate and to meet their own goals and sustainability strategy and targets. They will wait. They will ask to one of the big five to help, have then a clean sheet, and it all ends in the hands of legal affairs. And I can tell you, Richard, we will be very far away, even further away from the purpose. So how to really avoid this situation? Even more with the complex situation of having this due diligence law that you need to take and to address in a horizontal, multi-department approach in companies, with what will come out on forced labor, the other regulation, the CSRD on transparency and their standards, or even the European taxonomy. So that is one risk. If companies are too late, it ends up with just more audits and more paper, admin paper. Nobody is served. Nobody is served. That's one comment. The second comment of the due diligence proposal from the Commission, it includes an Article 14 that nobody reads, by the way. I read the reports of all the NGOs that are working on this due diligence regulation, and their report is looking article after article, any kind of comments where the proposal could be improved according to them. Not a single comment on Article 14, and Article 14 is the only article that is mentioning the need for accompanying measures. But it's almost an empty box. They say, member states shall set up and operate individually or jointly dedicated websites, platforms, or portals. Okay. European Commission may complement some member state supports. Okay, I know the principles of subsidiarity, but we are not evolving in a time where you can expect these major players just may complement. Member states may financially support SMEs. I can continue, it's very short, but I will not do, we have no time. But I encourage you maybe to have a look at this Article 14 and see where we might still, because there is still a negotiation going on, where we might still build the case for having a much more robust Article 14 that is dedicated to accompanying measures.
Thank you, Jan, and obviously those specific measures, I just want to reflect on the the framework of this meeting here as well. Obviously, we have in this project developed those roadmaps, and that's fantastic. But the next, even more important step with any action plan or roadmap is to act on it. And I think quite fittingly, obviously, the Commission is labeling their next big thing the Raw Materials Act. So I think they realize that action is needed. But Cecilia, I want to also give you the opportunity. Richard disagreed with you there on one point, and also maybe to reflect on what Jan just mentioned.
Yeah, sure. So I agree. So with what Richard said, I agree, the responsibility, again, it's not just on the mining companies, right? It's on the wider value chain, it's on each actor, it's on the refining companies, it's on the battery manufacturers, it's really all along, it's a value chain effort. And that's why, as TNE, we really support the work that co-legislators have done on the battery regulation, for example. So the EU battery regulation is the first example of a law proposal that looks at a product in its life cycle, and it goes and tackles those those implementation issues that Jan also mentioned, right? So the battery regulation sets clear due diligence rules that economic operators should respect along their supply chain when introducing a product on the market. The product in this case is batteries, of course, for electric vehicles, for industrial use. and hopefully also portable batteries, so the ones in our phones and laptops. Why is it key? Well, because the economic operator could be the battery company, the car company, to really do that effort of due diligence all along the supply chain, bringing together all the different examples. Jan mentioned the Drive Sustainability initiative earlier, for instance. I do think that the automotive sector can learn from other sectors, of course, the jewelry sector, the electronic sector, but is doing a really good job and has accelerated efforts in these past years around, around incentivizing sustainability. One key example is that some car makers have bumped up mining companies to tier 1 status. So mining companies, traditionally tier 4, tier 5 suppliers of automotive companies, they have been bumped up to a tier 1 status. It means greater relationship, a better relationship, greater scrutiny, of course, but here we're going for the long-term goal, right? It's not the short-term objectives. And then with regards to what Jan said on the these different legislative proposals of the EU, of course, they need to all come together. The finance sector has a huge role to play in this, and we cannot ignore the role that it should play. And yes, part of it is paperwork, and it's the big fours, big fives, whatever, and it's the auditing and all that. But we should know where the money goes, and we should favor projects that actually invest in better sustainability. So that's another aspect of the Critical Raw Materials Act. The EU wants to finance projects, that's great. But let's finance projects that actually respect certain conditions, that help build a strategic value chain in Europe. And if some of the investments are with partners abroad, again, conditionality is key. We want basically resilient supply chains, but also responsible supply chains.
Yeah, absolutely, Cecilia. Yeah, I can just fully agree on what you said there. That I mean, it's always one of the key points, right? Investment and collaboration, setting it up, but then to actually translate that into a meaningful activity that really creates this impact. That's something that Europe, I can say, and the Commission is certainly trying through actions like this resourcing project here. But there's also room for improvement, I believe. And I would pass it on to Ashlyn before a last round of reflections. And with that last round of reflections, I really, again, want to bring it into the geopolitical situation. So do you see Europe positioned well? All these aspects, very detailed and sometimes technical aspects that we discussed now, but I want to bring it up to more of a bird's eye view now towards the end. Usually we go the other way around. We're doing it back to front, but sometimes it's good to approach things differently. So Ashlyn, maybe a few last reflections before we go into that last round with a more geopolitical view again.
Absolutely. So I think just a few observations from the last discussion. So I think it's a really good point, I think, Jan, that you made around the pace of adoption of regulation, because I think if, as much as there may be issues with forced legislation through the EU, what that does is that sets a framework, which is really important. I think there's certainly a need for further guidance when it comes to the types of legislation that gets set around due diligence, because ultimately what happens is companies like ourselves will invariably engage externally and with very high-powered consultants to help figure out what that means. And I think we miss a trick through that. I think we also get fairly inundated with a series of different providers that come to us with ready-made solutions. And I think being able to distill what do we actually need versus what's being positioned becomes really challenging, which increases the cost of compliance both for us, and we can absorb some of it, but critically for suppliers that need to work in that space. I do think, with that said, if it's left for too long for industry to make a call, invariably you'll get two camps. One is a camp where you have folks that will self-regulate and actually try to get ahead of the curve, and you will get the ones that will wait till the absolute end. And the risk you have is industry as a whole not being able to collaborate more effectively or get the benefit of scale, which then makes it really difficult when you try to apply common lens of due diligence, because what you invariably get done is a lot of duplication of effort, which defeats the point. So I think those were really good points, and really enjoyed listening to that discussion. I think just the one point I want to leave, just given, again, the perspective that we bring, is I'm a big fan of due diligence, because that helps my agenda in the organization, and it helps us push for certain things, right? But with that said, there's a very real risk, and I've seen this in multiple industries, where as a consequence of suppliers not being able to meet due diligence requirements, they get excluded from opportunities. And that goes to the point that we were trying to make around how do you drive inclusive growth, which tries to drive community value and community wealth as a consequence of the work. We have to acknowledge that a lot of our suppliers work in nuanced environments. So Jan, you spoke about some of the work in Richard, you spoke about some of the work in the DRC and the challenges that some of the producers face. We need to bear in mind that we often find suppliers that work in very nuanced political landscapes where you don't often have good regulation, and often to get things done requires flexibility, for lack of a better word. I think there's a sophistication element as well, by the nature of geopolitics and the way certain businesses may have had exposure to formalized business training, etc., which makes it difficult for them to adopt some of the practices. I think the realities on the ground as well, in terms of meeting absolute compliance, the risk of creating a super high bar without an in-between space where you allow for remediation and engagement with suppliers to understand what their plans are of risk resolution. I think it's very easy to make a decision, say, well, that's too risky, let's move away and use another supply. And I think that, I don't think many companies have invested in creating that capacity. And I suspect that is something which invariably creates a pool of bigger, more successful suppliers that are able to demonstrate compliance, that ultimately get the benefit of opportunities that come across, to the detriment of new emerging players that we need to be more sensitive towards. Yeah, I think just in summary of mind, I think regulation, I feel it's important because it drives a level of traction. I think clarity on that regulation is super important, and the way folks look at that, and the way we as companies that buy those services need to position ourselves to the market in terms of our long-term plan, and how the plan tends to create more equity, is something we're probably not great at generally from a corporate perspective. And I speak about multiple industries, not necessarily my company in that, but I do think it requires a very different narrative where you look at what are the rights of people that are impacted by decisions that you make in supply chain? How does that translate into potential abuses of fundamental human rights? How can that be transformed into discussion on livelihoods improvement by looking at where one plays and taking a view, sometimes an extraordinary view beyond just that industry, but allied industries, which can actually stimulate and diversify where small suppliers could work.
Thanks, Ashlyn. And then maybe one last round of comments, as I said, maybe from more of a bird's eye perspective, and maybe also I kind of get the feeling that all these aspects we touched on, they're there irrespective of the geopolitical situation in a way. So we obviously are seeing these added pressures. But from the discussion, I feel, and you can comment on that now in the last round of comments here and reflections, that doesn't necessarily change, our compass. That doesn't change the direction. That doesn't change the underlying issues that we're seeing and that we need to address meaningfully. But yeah, if I'm completely wrong here, please, I want to hear your point of view. And let's start with Cecilia. We do the opening round again. Cecilia, please.
Again, I'll repeat what I said earlier. We do, and what was said by other panelists as well. the way forward is definitely a collaborative approach. So I'll take that from Jan. Thank you. It's a collaborative approach between industry, between civil society, but also workers, policymakers, and so on. We do think that the mining industry should be regulated, and as Ashlyn said, due diligence can be an effective tool. We do believe that car companies, so if we think, they do have the power to help drive this change by, collaboratively working with their suppliers. We do believe in IRMA, the Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance, as an effective tool to get there because of the way it's been designed. It's a multi-stakeholder organization. NGOs have veto rights. Audits are public and transparent. And yeah, as I said at the beginning in the opening remarks, the European Green Deal is going to require a lot of raw materials as we shift away from fossil fuels. So take from what Richard said about also, demand reduction, not making, those bigger cars, looking at other ways of getting these raw materials, whether it is from urban mining or from tailings, from mine waste, or it is from black mass, so waste from batteries manufacturing. So we need to be creative, and Europe needs to set goals, for example, as to how much of the critical raw material demands come from secondary streams. So really reducing primary demand. And then finally, the importance of local communities. I don't think we've spoken enough about it today. It's a huge challenge. But it's also an opportunity, right? So how do we ensure that communities are engaged before, during, and after process of mining projects? Before, it means free, prior, and informed consent. During, it means engaging them in social and environmental due diligence, because often local communities are the first ones that can flag issues. And after, it means what do we do with these sites, right, afterwards, especially if they're open pit or, around biodiversity, around, restoring the site. Can the local community also have a voice in what happens after we've mined everything we had to?
Thank you, Cecilia. Yeah, and I know we actually do have some excellent examples, positive examples as well, and maybe that's another thing that also needs to happen, that bad news are obviously always spread more easily sometimes than the good news. But Jan, over to you, and then we go to Ashlyn and Richard closing off.
Yeah, one point I take back home, not that it is new to us, but it is something that is easily you lose easily sight from what Richard was flagging at the end. Any meeting should start with what is the purpose. And thank you for that, because you can really get lost into the bush with all the very interesting aspects that we have been discussing, but I think purpose is really important. And I think over the last couple of years, we might have lost sight of purpose, and it's only market driven, as you explained. Now, one point I wanted to just touch on, listening to Ashlyn, it's about these camps. Today, through the studies that we have done with Moody's, analyzing thousands of companies on their ESG performance and gaps, we see that almost in every industry sector, the gap between champions and, if I'm polite, I would say followers. If I'm not polite, I would say laggards. The gap is very, very big already today. And that is why we try at CSA Europe to really encourage business leaders, CEOs, CFOs to spend maybe less time in Davos or in New York or in the capitals or in the COPs with all the speeches we know now almost by heart, but to spend that time into their own family, which is not maybe the most pleasant place, but it's in your industry sector and federation, and to really help them to equip themselves with the intelligence and the tools which they as an industry association or federation should provide to the hundreds, if not thousands, of their corporate members. And we also made a proposal to the Commission to invest in European/international sector alliances on due diligence. They have to continue the work that is being started in the due diligence, but they have to tailor it according to all the different realities and specificities of the value chains they are in. So that is something that I wanted to highlight. And once there will be more maturity from, let's say, a sector industry on due diligence, we will be able to start finally a cross-sector collaboration. Is it at local level or at more global level? But we know that we need more than only a sector approach. So that's very important. But at the end, if we really want to reach impact, the cross-sectoral collaboration is as vital as the other one. And I will stop here. Sorry, it was already too long.
No. It's we're actually, we had a bit more time at the beginning, but now we have 5 minutes left. We're doing well. We're doing exceedingly well, and it's a very good and lively discussion. So I love that. Moving on to Ashlyn. Yeah, closing remarks from you.
Great, thanks, Patrick. So look, after Cecilia and Jan highlighted those points, there's very little more that I can say because I think we're on the same page. I think for me, what's really positive is we've all acknowledged this need for interdependency around this different work. And I think that's super critical, right? So whether that's from a customer perspective or, Jan, to your point about cross industries and the way we work smarter together, Cecilia, the points that you've made around supplier collaboration, I think we're moving to a space where we're a lot more acutely aware of what these things mean. And I think the challenges this poses back to us, certainly as a buying company, would be how do we simplify and clearly articulate what we expect both within our business and from our suppliers and to our customers, and try to demonstrate these pathways around why we're doing what we're doing. I think the points on purpose, it's so critical because often that can be lost if one is not very clear about where they play. But yeah, I think not much to it. I think there's certainly a role to play around advocacy, and I think we've spoken about IRMA and some of the work that they're doing, but I certainly think that both within the industries and cross-industry advocacy is super important because it also allows, and Jan, just to use your word, it also allows best practice sharing between folks that are, I'm not going to say leading, I think people that are trying and failing often, but moving forward with the laggards. And I think when we think about capacity, we need to also think about the industries that we work within and very, very disaggregated players, whether it's in mining or other sectors, and being able to get to a point where there's consensus on the things that we all need to do to be able to hold our heads up and say, well, we run ethical businesses. And I think that's where advocacy becomes super critical and something that certainly we need to put a lot more focus in more generally.
Thank you, Ashlyn. Yeah, very good. And Richard, you have the honor of the last closing remarks.
Yeah, thank you. So I want to remind maybe the audience of two things. So, and it's very, very dangerous. So right now it's a customer who makes the rules. So yeah, so we are the customers in the Western countries, and we make the rules for everyone. And so most of the time it can be a good thing because we have maybe a better overview of what's going on, but it can be dangerous, and hell is paved with good intentions. And the other problem is that we do not take responsibility of everything. And the danger is that we will exclude communities because we make rules that are not sustainable for these communities. So, for example, if we exclude the DRC, the problem is that the cobalt in the DRC is a huge part of the GDP. So it's fine to say that we don't want the cobalt from the DRC, but the local communities, the entire country depends on that. And it's the case for many countries, like Namibia or many of the Latin American countries. If we make the rules that are not acceptable for the local communities, then it is a problem. And I think we have to be very careful on that. And at the end of the day, so we have to take responsibility of that and change the role of mining. And as I said, is that the purpose of mining should be a driver of long-term well-being and not the opposite. And if we take that in account, then we might be able to change things. But we have to take the responsibility, we as European, that it is the case.
Thank you, Richard. Actually, I don't want to even add anything to that. Fantastic closing remarks there. And I want to thank you with that, all panelists. Thank you, Cecilia. Thank you, Ashlyn. Thank you, Jan. Thank you, Richard. I thought it was a very lively and interesting discussion. We touched on many things. And let me assure you, this is only the start of this conference, and we will certainly hear much more about, for example, technical aspects, and also about how the industry can actually act on these aspects and make things happen in a meaningful way, also benefiting local communities. So all these aspects will be discussed from different angles and perspectives throughout the 3 days that we have here. So with that, thank you very much. I really enjoyed this panel discussion with you, and back over to Ursula.
Thank you so much. Everybody's clapping hands. Thank you very much, Patrick. Thank you to all the people who were in your session. Thank you for this wonderful start of the conference. And there were some remarks in the chat boxes everywhere where people said, thanks for the great discussions and the good interesting insight. So this was the first part, and giving you the opportunity to digest what you just heard. Let's have a break now.